Please come in and take your seats. We're going to get started. Thank you very much. Delighted to see so many of you here on day 2 of our conference. This is fantastic. We had a great day yesterday. I think we had some really compelling speakers, and we had a very good speech from the President of Georgia at a reception last evening. Yesterday we talked a lot about what's going on internally in Georgia, some of the domestic political divisions, and the hope that we can see Georgians pull together and show more unity, address some higher order national issues, and keep going. Today we're turning more to the international relationships of Georgia and the security environment in the neighborhoods surrounding Georgia. So we have panels that will be talking about what's going on in Ukraine, about Turkey, about Russia, lessons learned from past NATO enlargement, Brexit, what's going on with the United States, whether the United States after our elections, which will be at the end of the day. But to kick off the day this morning, we are delighted that we have with us the former Secretary General of NATO, андерс Fogh Rasmussen. He served at a critical moment in NATO. He took office after Russia's invasion of Georgia and then tried to shepherd the re-engagement with Russia while dealing with the effects of Russia's invasion and occupation, along with many other issues during his tenure as Secretary General. And moderating our conversation today is Ir Meramishvili, Senior Editor with Voice of America's Georgian Service. So, Ia and андерс Fogh Rasmussen, please come to the...
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you very much, Kurt. And what a great guest to have to kick off the second day of this great conference. And I won't take much time with my intro. Let's just start talking about Georgia. How important do you think Georgia is to NATO? And what makes Georgia important, if it is?
First of all, it's a great pleasure to be here. I have studied this piece of art. In particular, a part of Denmark, Greenland, and I see you, boom, it said. Maybe it's a hint to President Trump, who wanted to purchase a part of my country. Okay, it's a great pleasure to be here, in particular because I think Georgia is extremely important to Europe, to the United States. I think from a strategic point of view, Georgia has a very important location, speaking about energy pipelines. It is really a focal point for Russia and for Europe. And for us, it's extremely important that Georgia continues on a path of reforms and rapprochement vis-à-vis the European Union and NATO.
Yeah. What's Georgia's role in Afghanistan, for example? If you could just elaborate a bit more on that aspect of Georgia's importance to the alliance. How important is Georgia's involvement with NATO operations?
Georgia is one of the major contributors to our operation in Afghanistan. Actually, during many years, Georgia was the main non-NATO contributor to our operation in Afghanistan. I think it's all in all, over the years, 11,000 Georgian troops who have contributed to the NATO-led operation in Georgia. Georgia has also suffered, unfortunately, some casualties. And of course, for many Georgians, it is a challenge to understand why we in Afghanistan. But at the end of the day, it's a question partly about solidarity within our alliance and our partners. Through your engagement in Afghanistan, you demonstrate a willingness and a capability to not only be a consumer of security, but also a producer of security. So that's why for Georgia it's very important to be in Afghanistan, and for NATO it's been invaluable to receive all the contributions from Georgia.
We're at a very interesting time in NATO internal dynamics now. And there's been a talk, no decisions have been made, but there's a talk about NATO, or at least the US, withdrawing from Afghanistan. What do you think NATO is going to do in Afghanistan? And in case NATO withdraws, what would the alliance tell the Georgians who've sacrificed so much?
First of all, I don't think neither NATO nor the United States will withdraw from Afghanistan in the near future. There's been some negotiations. We've also seen the negotiations in the near term hasn't produced the necessary results. I think it's dangerous to outline withdrawal schemes based on the calendar. We should never do that on the basis of a calendar, but on the basis of conditions on the ground. And I think the main problem we have experienced is that the patience in our countries has been too low. We have been too eager to outline timetables for a withdrawal from Afghanistan. And consequently, the Taliban thinks that they can just wait us out. They can just sit down and wait, continue their attacks on the local people, and wait for us to withdraw. I think unfortunately, we have to stay in Afghanistan until the job has been finished. And it's not finished yet, so we have to stay. Mm-hmm. But first of all, of course, with a view to training and education of local security forces so they can take over responsibility for security themselves. We are not an occupying force. We will leave as soon as the conditions are fulfilled to do so. But we shouldn't announce any withdrawal until we are sure that the Afghan security forces are able to take responsibility for security themselves.
Let's come back to Georgia for a bit again. Georgia's been receiving the annual national plan for 11 years now. What do you think has changed? Has it been helpful? And in light of this 11 years, do you think Georgia still requires MAP in order to join NATO?
I think that is a crucial question. I understand very well, as many people in Georgia are a bit impatient. Let me remind you that in 2008, at the Bucharest summit, we decided that Georgia and Ukraine will become members of NATO. That decision still stands. In the run-up to the Bucharest summit, we discussed whether we would grant MAP to Georgia and Ukraine. We couldn't achieve the necessary support for that. You know, NATO can only take decisions by unanimity. And there were some resistance against granting MAP to Georgia and Ukraine. Instead, we decided that you will become members of NATO. Actually, that's much stronger, because in a membership action plan, there's no guarantee that you will become members at the end of the day. But we decided that Georgia and Ukraine will become members. We have established a NATO-Georgia Commission. We have established a NATO-Ukraine Commission. And now we are continuing the reform work within the framework of those commissions. So far, so good. But I am sure that we did the wrong thing in 2008. I was in favor of granting membership action plan to Georgia and Ukraine. I think we should have done that. I think we sent the wrong message to Putin, a message of hesitation, lack of decisiveness, and he exploited that situation. And I see a clear link between that NATO hesitation at the April summit in 2008 and his attack against Georgia in August 2008. He wanted to send a clear message to Georgia and not least to NATO, don't meddle in our neighborhood. So I think we could have avoided that if we had granted MAP to Georgia and Ukraine. We didn't, but we are now continuing the reform process, and it's of utmost importance that Georgia stay on this course, continue reforms, continue to fulfill NATO criteria, because when NATO is ready, you have to be ready to enter NATO.
No. Georgia has elections coming up in 2020. And we've talked about the elections here at this conference, and generally we talk about Georgia, importance of those elections. What do you think? How important are those elections coming up? And how important is the reforms process for NATO? Is it a requirement? Do Georgians need to take it very, very seriously?
Of course. Georgia must take the reform process very, very seriously and continue reforms, not only in the military sector. I think Georgia has gone a long way. You have achieved a lot of results. I think when it comes to the military, you have demonstrated an ability to live up to NATO standards. And then, of course, you also need to broaden the reform scope. It's also about determined fight against corruption. It's about guaranteeing the rule of law, etc., etc. So you have to continue on that path. I think we have also to consider another aspect, both in Georgia and within NATO, namely the question about Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Because if one day we consider Georgia ready to join the alliance, we also have to make sure that Article 5 is still credible. Article 5, which would require NATO to actually help Georgia if Georgia is attacked. But obviously, it is a problem to have unresolved border disputes with Russia in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. So the question is, how could that be solved? I think you have to discuss internally in Georgia, would you, in that case, be willing to accept an arrangement where NATO's Article 5 will only cover the territory that is actually controlled by the Georgian government? And in NATO, we also have to reflect on exactly the same question. We have a president, Germany was divided in East and West Germany. Germany entered NATO in 1955, but only West Germany. East Germany did not. The NATO rules didn't apply to East Germany. But when Germany was reunified in 1990 and 91, NATO rules then also covered East Germany. In principle, the same arrangement could be elaborated for Georgia. But of course it's controversial to discuss that in Georgia as well as in NATO. But I think we have to confront that, because if we don't, then we have provided a de facto veto to President Putin, who can forever prevent Georgia, Ukraine, and other of his neighboring countries from joining NATO just by creating those simmering conflicts and keep them simmering.
One last question before I open the floor for questions, so please think about your questions as we get closer to it. You talked about NATO, about President Putin, and about how his aggression with the neighboring countries has been basically sort of a participation in some of the West's decision-making, including NATO membership for Ukraine or Georgia. There is we often say or ask ourselves this question: does Putin have veto on NATO's decision-making? On top of that, Russia continues its military aggression in Ukraine, in Georgia. Just a week ago, we had another case of borderization, illegal borderization, which means moving defenses into the Georgian controlled territory. Given how large the stakes are and how complicated Georgia's Russia problems are, what would you recommend to the Georgian government? What are the thoughts you could share with them as to how to deal with Russia?
Well, Georgia is a neighbor of Russia. So I think it's inevitable to try to develop relations with Russia as much as you can, as far as you can. I don't see any alternative to that. But I think it's important to understand the psychology of President Putin. You can choose two ways, so to speak. Either you can give concessions and be soft and accommodating towards him, or you try to be firm and keep a united stance and confronting Russia with the realities. I belong to the latter camp, no doubt. I think President Putin only understands one kind of language, the language of power. So, in order to engage Russia, I think we need to demonstrate a firm stance and unity between Europe and the United States. We should speak with one voice and tell Putin that he is best served, that Russia is best served with cooperation instead of confrontation. But in order to get him to understand that, I think it's important the hard way to demonstrate that Georgia is not alone, we are all in this, and we will keep a united stance. I'm not anti-Russian, on the contrary. Actually, I think the West and Russia share so many interests, economically as well as security-wise, that we should cooperate. But the current regime in the Kremlin has decided otherwise, and I think the only way we can get them to understand that they should re-enter the path of cooperation is to demonstrate that the United States and Europe are together in confronting Russia with sanctions and other measures until they understand that they should engage more constructively.
Well, thank you very much, and I wish we had more time, but I'm sure we have some questions in the audience, so if anybody wants to ask a question. Please, yes.
Thank you so much. Zviada Zimbaya from the Fletcher School on Diplomacy. My question is about the Article 5 controversial issue that you discussed. Where shall we start if Georgia decides that to go with that plan? Thanks.
Well,
Where shall we start? If Georgia decides to join NATO without Article 5 covering the occupied regions?
where to start?
Where to start, yeah. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I think you have to discuss in Georgia whether it's acceptable to join a security organization and an internationally recognized part of Georgia is not covered by Article 5. You have to make up your mind whether you will accept that. Once you have accepted that, you can go to NATO and say, okay, as part of your NATO reflections on a possible Georgian membership of NATO, we are willing to accept such an arrangement. That could be raised in the NATO-Georgia Commission, for instance, and then the NATO allies will have something to chew on, so to speak. Because now it's too easy for the hesitant member states to point to Georgia and say, okay, but you have unresolved border disputes with Russia. We cannot guarantee any security for Georgia. We cannot let Article 5 cover the whole of Georgia because you have those problems. So I think the first step should be taken in Georgia to discuss this and then go to NATO. The fact is, if you read those 11 annual programs, Georgia is fulfilling almost all conditions. I think that's fair to say. But you still have that problem with your borders. But on the other hand, we cannot let Putin have the veto right. It's not for him to decide whether Georgia can join NATO. It's for the Georgian government and for NATO Council to decide. So to get off that hook, so to speak, I think the Georgians should start taking that discussion internally.
Please, yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's been a great start to the morning. My question is, do you think it is this conflict, the frozen conflict, which is holding some of our allies from going forward in this NATO enlargement? Because as the Turkish ambassador, our position is well known about Georgia, and as well as it is for Northern Macedonia, and for Bosnia as well. So do you think if we now manage to get the Georgians on board to the table and say that they will give up their Article 5 right, do you think there will be a consensus in NATO? Thank you.
Not in the first instance, you can be quite sure. I know the attitude in some of the member states, there will be a lot of reluctance, but it will take away one major argument. There will be a lot of discussions. We also have had a lot of discussions on North Macedonia before taking that decision. But finally, the North Macedonians and the Greeks reached an agreement to take away the name dispute, and then an argument was taken off the table, and allies had to go to the core of the issue, and finally they agreed by consensus. I wouldn't exclude the same possibility. It won't be round the corner, but we have to start this process, because otherwise, Putin can continue his games. But this is not just about Georgia. This is not just about Abkhazia and South Ossetia. It's also about Crimea. It's about the Donbas region in Ukraine. It's about Transnistria in Moldova, and basically it's also about Nagorno-Karabakh. By creating and fueling those simmering conflicts, Putin hopes to keep his neighbors weak, focused on the conflicts, and he hopes to prevent them from joining NATO and the European Union, because he knows very well that in NATO and in the European Union we are reluctant to import unsolved border disputes. But we cannot allow him to maintain this de facto veto right. So to prevent him from exploiting those issues, I think we should start a process. It won't be solved round the corner, but if the Georgians decide, okay, we will accept that Article 5 only covers the Georgian territory which is controlled by and where the Georgian government exercises sovereignty, that is, exclude Abkhazia, South Ossetia in the first instance, then we can start a process. By that we can send a very clear signal to the Kremlin. Don't continue on that path. It won't be a positive development for you.
And this is the last question. If I saw another hand, so maybe if we can combine two questions.
Sure. Thank you very much for the insightful conversation, both of you. Vajra Taberza from Institute of War and Peace reporting. A slightly impish question there. You mentioned that the only way to surpass Putin's de facto veto is for Georgia to become a member country via Cyprus model. What I would like to ask is, did you come to this understanding during your tenure, or is it a hindsight? And if you indeed held such beliefs before, what was done to further this goal? I mean, what were the practical steps taken?
And please, there was a hand in the back as well.
My name is Nina Lapeshule, Tbilisi State University Institute for European Studies. I have a question related to a global strategy of European Union on foreign security policy, where we have the long passages related to increasing the resilience of European Union military forces so that in case of necessity they can act autonomously. What could be the position about that? Will that increase the powers and influence of NATO, or how could you interpret that passages in the global strategy? And the second question is related to...
I think that would be good.
It's related how to increase the resilience of the Eastern Partnership countries, those, let's say, who are more successful in this Eastern Partnership project. Thank you.
Maybe I don't quite understand the first question about Cyprus, but because Cyprus has not applied for membership of NATO. Beg your pardon?
What I meant to ask is, you described the model like Germany used to, that when the Article 5 would not cover the breakaway regions, let's call them that. What I wanted to ask, did you hold such beliefs? Was this kind of scenario discussed during your tenure as a Secretary General, or is it a hindsight? Did you came to that understanding after your tenure as a Secretary General finished?
Well, it was discussed, but at that time, I think Georgia was not that advanced as it is now. Now you have turned your 11th annual national program, and my conclusion is, for all practical purposes, Georgia fulfills the necessary criteria. So the question is, what remains? And I see this border issue as the main remaining problem. So that's why I'm focusing on that now. It wasn't relevant to discuss at that stage. EU and NATO. Well, first of all, I'm very much in favor of a strengthened EU defense cooperation. I think all efforts to increase the European countries' investments in defense should be appreciated. The European Union has created a special fund to finance joint investments. I called it smart defense within NATO, where member states pool their resources and they purchase expensive military equipment jointly instead of individually. All that stuff, that's positive. And I think the structured cooperation within the European Union when it comes to defense should also move forward. I'm all for it. But let's face it, NATO will remain the cornerstone of European and North Atlantic security. In particular, after Brexit, 80% of defense investments will take place outside the European Union. So the European Union will, for, I would say, generations to come, remain a very small part of the overall security. So I think Brexit will result in, relatively speaking, a strengthened NATO. And this is the reason why I am very much for a strengthened cooperation between NATO and the European Union. And a lot can be done in that area.
That's a high note to end, I guess, a conversation on that. NATO hopefully will get stronger. And some of the processes that we're seeing in Europe will only strengthen the alliance and its resilience. So thank you very much for joining this conversation and for being at this conference. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.